The galaxy declared humanity extinct. Only one human warship survived. It came back for revenge. Part 1. The Last Fire. Commander Mara Voss stood at the wide observation window of the warship Endurance and watched the stars. They were quiet. They were always quiet now. But quiet was not the same as peaceful. She had learned that difference the hard way, in the worst hours of her life, when everything she had ever known had been taken from her in a single terrible night. The Endurance was a warship of the human galactic navy. It was not the biggest ship ever built by humanity. It was not the most powerful, but it was the only one left. That was the one fact that Mara carried with her every morning when she woke up, and every night when she tried to sleep and could not. She was the commander of the last human warship in the entire galaxy, and the weight of that truth pressed down on her like a stone that never moved, never lightened, and never let her rest. 3 years had passed since the night the Galactic Council had declared humanity extinct. 3 years since the Keth Empire, the Vorath Alliance, and the Sural Dominion had moved together in perfect coordination and destroyed every human colony, every human station, every human ship they could find. The attack had been so fast, so complete, and so devastating that most humans had not even had time to understand what was happening before it was over. Billions of people were gone, entire worlds silent. The places where children had played and people had grown old and families had lived for generations, all of it, reduced to ash and floating debris in the cold dark of space. The Galactic Council, the political body that claimed to govern all the known civilizations of the galaxy, had made its announcement shortly after the attacks concluded. A calm, official voice had spoken in every known language, including the human tongues, and it had said, "Humanity has been removed. The experiment of the human species has ended. The galaxy moves forward." That was how they had said it. Like killing billions of people was an experiment. Like ending an entire civilization was just a step in a process. Mara had heard the announcement while the Endurance was running silent through the edge of the Tessari Nebula, hiding with its engines cold and its lights off, tucked between clouds of glowing gas that scrambled most detection systems. They had been on a patrol mission when the attacks began. When the signals started dying, one after another, their communications officer, a young man named Den, who had just turned 26 and still kept a photo of his mother on his console, had looked at Mara with wide eyes and asked her what was happening. She had not known, not yet. But she had ordered silence. She had ordered stillness. Some instinct in her, some cold, deep part of her that had been trained for years to think in terms of survival, had told her to go dark and wait. And so the Endurance had sat in the nebula, breathing slowly, while everything outside it burned. They had listened to the last transmissions from human space. They had heard the military channels dissolve into chaos, and then into nothing. They had picked up civilian signals, people calling out for help, calling for rescue, calling for someone to come, and then those signals too had stopped. The silence that followed was the most horrible thing Mara had ever experienced. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a wound so deep that the body had simply stopped responding. When the Galactic Council's announcement came, Mara had been sitting in the captain's chair with her hands flat on the armrests, very still. Around her, her crew of 212 people had listened with pale faces and wet eyes. Some of them had cried quietly. Some had not made any sound at all. A few had walked away from their stations without saying anything, and Mara had let them go, because there was nothing she could have said that would have meant anything in that moment. She had stayed in her chair for a long time after the announcement ended. She had not cried. She had not spoken. She had just looked at the stars through the forward view screen and let the reality settle into her like cold water filling a hollow place. Humanity was gone. The Endurance had survived. 213 people, Mara plus her crew, were now all that remained of a species that had once numbered in the hundreds of billions. The days that followed had been the darkest of her life. There had been no clear path forward, no orders to follow, no government to report to, because the government was gone, no allies to call, because they had no allies. The galactic powers had just murdered everyone they knew and declared the whole thing finished. The Endurance was a ghost ship in a galaxy that had decided ghosts should not exist. Some of the crew had wanted to surrender. She understood that. They were frightened. They were grieving. They were tired. Surrendering felt like a way to make it stop. But Mara had looked at what had happened, the completeness of it, the deliberate totality, and she had known with cold certainty that there would be no mercy waiting for them if they gave themselves up. The Keth and the Vorath and the Surul had not left even a single human station standing. They had not taken prisoners. They had swept through human space like a fire and left nothing behind. People who did things like that did not stop because you held up your hands. So she had kept the Endurance running. She had set a course for the deep outer edge of the galaxy, beyond the reach of most patrol routes. She had kept the ship quiet, kept it dark, kept it moving, and slowly, painfully, over weeks and months, she had begun to think about what came next. It was not easy. Nothing about any of it was easy. Her crew were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were a mix. Some were military, some were scientists, some were engineers. Some had joined the Navy because they believed in something, and some had joined simply because it was a job. Now they were the last of their kind, and every one of them was struggling with that in their own way. Her first officer was a man named Soren Tak, who was quiet and careful, and very good at seeing problems before they became disasters. He had been with her for 4 years, and she trusted him in the way you could only trust someone who had already seen you at your worst and had not walked away. Soren had lost his wife and his 2 sons in the attacks. He never talked about them, but sometimes, in the early hours of the ship's night cycle, Mara would find him sitting alone in the observation lounge, just looking out at the stars with an expression on his face that she did not know how to describe. Not broken exactly, but not whole either. Her chief engineer was a woman named Petra Holm, who was loud and direct, and impossibly good at keeping things working that had no right to still be working. Petra had a way of treating problems like personal insults, as though the universe had offended her by allowing something to malfunction, and she intended to argue it back into proper function through sheer stubbornness. She had kept the Endurance running through situations that should have killed the ship 3 times over. Mara counted on her, the way she counted on gravity. Her medical officer was a quiet, thin man named Dr. Cassius Rell, who had been a surgeon in a civilian hospital before the war, and had taken a commission because he believed medicine should go where people needed it most. He had been dealing with the psychological damage to the crew since the first night, and it was taking a visible toll on him. He slept poorly. He ate less than he should. He still showed up every day and did his job, and Mara respected him enormously for that. There were others, 200 more, each of them a complete person with a history and a grief, and a reason to keep going, or a reason to wonder why they should. Mara knew their names. She made it her business to know their names. In a crew of 213, you could not afford to let anyone become just a number. For the first year, survival had been the only goal. The Endurance had moved carefully through the outer regions, avoiding shipping lanes, avoiding any populated system, staying away from anything that might draw attention. They had found a few uninhabited systems with resources, ice-bearing moons they could mine for water, asteroid fields with usable metals, gas giants with harvestable fuel compounds. They had become very good at taking what they needed from empty places and leaving no trace. During that first year, Mara had also begun collecting information. The Endurance had excellent sensor equipment and a long-range communications array that could passively pick up signals from a great distance. She had assigned people to monitor galactic communications constantly, building up a picture of the wider galaxy, what the Keth were doing, where the Vorath were moving, what the Surul Dominion had decided to do with the human worlds they had taken. The answer to that last question had not surprised her, but it had made the cold thing inside her grow colder. The Surul Dominion had moved settlers into the human worlds. They were already building new cities on top of the ruins of old ones. The Keth had claimed certain human military facilities and converted them into their own bases. The Vorath had taken resources, entire planets stripped for materials. The galaxy had not just killed humanity, it had immediately moved on, as though humanity had been a problem to be solved, and now the problem was gone, and the space it had occupied was being redistributed, like property at an estate sale. By the end of the first year, Mara had a complete picture. By the beginning of the second year, she had a plan. It was not a small plan. It was not a safe plan. The crew had argued about it for weeks when she first presented it, and some of them still argued about it now, 3 years in. even as the pieces were slowly coming together. But it was the only plan that made sense to her, and she had learned to trust her instincts, even when they led her somewhere difficult. She was going to make the galaxy pay for what it had done to humanity, not by charging in blindly, not by throwing the Endurance at the nearest enemy fleet in a blaze of fury. That would just be dying, and dying was not revenge. Revenge required something more. It required patience, and intelligence, and the willingness to do things that would take time and hurt in the doing. She was going to rebuild, not in the sense of replacing what had been lost. That was impossible. She could not bring back the dead worlds or the dead people, but she was going to rebuild the capacity to fight. The Endurance was a powerful ship, but one ship was not enough. She needed more. She needed weapons, technology, allies if she could find them, and above all, she needed time. The second year had been spent in careful, dangerous work. The Endurance had raided several abandoned military depots that the Keth and Vorath had not yet fully claimed. They had found weapons caches, equipment, raw materials. They had pulled the survivors of 2 damaged human automated freighters out of deep storage, ships that had been running on autopilot with no crew, triggered by emergency protocols when the attacks began, drifting in the outer dark waiting for commands that had never come. Those ships were not warships, but they could be converted. Petra had looked at them with the expression she got when she was deciding how to yell at a problem until it cooperated. They had also found, in the ruins of a station near the destroyed colony world of Heron, a small group of survivors, 9 people. 2 of them were badly injured. All of them were terrified. They had been hiding in a sealed maintenance section of the station for almost a year, surviving on emergency rations and recycled water, too afraid to transmit a signal in case something hostile was listening. Mara had been on the shuttle that went to get them. She remembered the moment when the maintenance hatch had opened, and those 9 people had seen a human face for the first time in nearly a year. The sound they had made was not quite a cry, and not quite a laugh. It was something that had no proper name, some expression of a feeling that most people were lucky enough to never need to make. They were part of the crew now. The Endurance had 222 people. Every addition felt like something recovered from the dark. In the 3rd year, Mara had turned her attention to understanding the enemy. Not just their movements and their military positions, but them, what they thought, what they wanted, why they had done what they had done, because the why mattered. Revenge was not just about hitting back, it was about understanding the thing you were hitting back at. What she had found, pieced together from intercepted communications and old diplomatic records, and everything she had been able to pull from the archives of human intelligence services before those archives went dark, was complex, and in some ways more disturbing than simple cruelty would have been. The Keth, the Vorath, and the Surul had not acted from hatred alone. There had been politics. There had been calculation. Humanity, in the century before the attacks, had expanded very quickly. Too quickly, some had felt. Human colonies had spread into regions that the Keth considered part of their traditional sphere of influence. Human trade had disrupted markets that the Vorath depended on. Human diplomatic alliances had shifted the balance of power in the Galactic Council in ways that made the Surul Dominion nervous. None of these were good reasons for what had been done. Mara was very clear in her own mind about that. But they were reasons, and understanding them meant she could use them. Because if those 3 powers had coordinated to commit genocide, then they had also done something else. They had made enemies of each other's enemies. The Keth and the Vorath had a long history of competition. The Surul Dominion had border disputes with both of them that predated humanity's expansion by centuries. The alliance of convenience that had destroyed humanity was already, 3 years later, showing stress fractures. There were signals, quiet ones, careful ones, the kind of communications that powerful entities made when they were not yet ready to act openly, but were thinking about their options. Mara had been watching those signals very carefully. She stepped back from the observation window and turned to face the bridge. Her crew moved through their stations with the focused efficiency of people who had learned to do their jobs under extreme pressure. Den, the communications officer who had first asked her what was happening on that terrible night, was at his console, headphones around his neck, scanning passively through signals. He was older now. They all were. 3 years of this kind of life aged you differently than 3 years of ordinary living. Anything? She asked. The Keth 7th Fleet is repositioning again, Den said, moving toward the Vorath border sector. Mara nodded. She had expected that. The pattern had been building for 6 weeks. And our contact? Signal received and confirmed. Den allowed himself a very small smile. They're ready to meet. Mara looked at Soren, who had been standing at the tactical station, watching the star map with that careful expression he wore when he was thinking hard about something. He caught her look and gave her a short nod. Then we go, she said. This was what 3 years of patience had been building toward. Not a battle, not yet. First, a meeting with someone who was not human, who had not participated in the genocide, but who had been watching it with a quiet, calculating interest of their own. The Tessian people were small in number and had never been a military power. They lived on 3 worlds in a cluster of systems near the galactic core, and they were best known, to those who knew of them at all, as archivists. The Tessian recorded things. They collected information, stored history, cataloged events. They had been doing this for longer than most current civilizations had existed, and they had watched the destruction of humanity with great attention. Mara had spent 18 months finding a way to reach them. It had required going through 3 different intermediaries, all of them small species with their own complicated reasons for not wanting to be seen talking to a human. It had required patience she had not been sure she possessed. But the signal had finally come, and it had said, "We will meet." She went to her quarters to prepare. They were small quarters. She had insisted on that, on taking the same allocation as everyone else on the ship, rather than the larger captain's space she was entitled to. On a ship where everyone was already giving everything they had, it did not feel right to take more than her share. The quarters held a bunk, a desk, a small shelf where she kept a few things that mattered to her. A photograph of her parents, taken on a beach she would never see again, because the world that beach had existed on was gone. A worn notebook, half filled with her own writing, not orders or reports, but something more like thinking out loud on paper, because she had found early on that she could not carry all of it in her head without spilling some of it somewhere. She sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at the photograph for a moment. Her parents were smiling in it. They had been people who smiled easily, which was something she had never quite inherited. Mara's own face tended toward a kind of careful steadiness that people sometimes mistook for coldness. She was not cold. She had learned to keep the warmth somewhere internal, somewhere it would not get in the way. She had been 34 when the attacks happened. She was 37 now. She felt older than that, but she had been told she did not look it, which she supposed was a small mercy. She put the photograph back on the shelf, stood up, and went to the small mirror above the sink. She looked at herself for a moment. Dark hair, pulled back, eyes that were gray and had, over the last 3 years, developed a kind of settled quality, not peaceful, but resolved. The face of someone who had decided something and was not going to be argued out of it. She went back to the bridge. The Endurance moved through space toward the meeting point, quiet and careful, the way it always moved now. Outside, the stars watched without expression, the way they always had. The galaxy had declared humanity extinct. It had made its announcement and moved on. But the galaxy had made a mistake. It had left one ship alive, and that ship, and the 222 people on it, were not extinct. They were thinking. They were planning. They were very, very angry. And they were not done. The meeting point was a dead system, a star that had burned out long ago, leaving behind only a cold white dwarf and a collection of airless, lightless rocks orbiting in permanent dark. Nothing lived here. Nothing came here. It was the kind of place the galaxy ignored, which was exactly why Mara had chosen it. The Tessian ship was already there when the Endurance arrived. It was smaller than Mara had expected, a curved, pale vessel that looked almost organic, like a bone shaped by slow water. It sat still against the dark of space, showing no weapons, no aggressive posture, just waiting. "Active scan?" Soren asked. "Passive only," Mara said. "We're the ones asking for help. We go in respectful." She took a shuttle across with Soren and Dr. Rell and a security officer named Jana, who was built like someone had designed a person specifically for the purpose of making other people feel less sure of themselves. They docked with the Tessian ship through an interface that adjusted automatically to their airlock configuration, a subtle display of technical sophistication that told Mara she was dealing with people who had been doing this for a very long time. The interior of the Tessian ship was dim and warm, with walls that curved gently inward and a faint smell like old paper. The Tessian themselves were smaller than humans, bipedal, with large eyes adapted for lower light and skin that was a deep blue-gray color. They moved carefully and deliberately, as though each action had been considered before being taken. The one who came to meet them was named Archivist Vel. He was old. Mara could tell that much, though she could not have explained exactly how she could tell. There was something in the way he carried himself that suggested centuries rather than decades. He looked at the four humans in the airlock with an expression that was very still and very attentive. "Commander Voss," he said, in careful but clear human speech. "We were not certain you were real." "We weren't certain you were real either," Mara said. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Please come. There is much to discuss." They followed him into the ship. The corridor they walked through was lined with what Mara first took for screens or windows, but which she quickly realized were shelves, shelf after shelf of data storage units, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. The Tessian had not been exaggerating when they called themselves archivists. They stored everything. They sat in a room that felt more like a library than a meeting space, at a table made of something that looked like dark glass. Archivist Vel settled across from Mara with a patience that seemed completely effortless. "We have watched your movements," he said, "for 2 years and 3 months, since you made contact with the first intermediary." "And before that?" Mara asked. "Since the attacks on your people." His voice was neutral, but his eyes were steady. "We observed. We recorded. We calculated the probability that any human ship had survived. We determined that probability to be less than 1%. You exceeded our models." "I'm good at that," Mara said. "Yes, we know." He set his small hands flat on the table in what seemed to be a gesture of openness. "You want information. You want assistance. And you want to know why we are willing to consider giving it." "Tell me why," Mara said. "Because what was done to your people was wrong," Vel said simply. "Not in a legal sense. The Galactic Council amended its own laws to permit it, which you may not have known. They classified humanity as an unsustainable expansionist threat and authorized the elimination action under Emergency Galactic Charter. Legally, under the rules they had written for themselves, what they did was permitted." Mara kept her face very still. She had not known about the legal framing, though she was not entirely surprised by it. That was how powerful systems worked. They changed the rules to make the worst things they did technically permitted. "But," Vel continued, "legal is not the same as right. And in the longer view, what they did was also unwise. The Keth, the Vorath, and the Sural have now demonstrated to every smaller civilization in this galaxy that when it becomes convenient, the powerful will simply erase the less powerful and rewrite the rules to justify it. That is a lesson other species have been watching and absorbing. There is a fear growing in the outer systems, a quiet fear, but real. And you want to use that fear," Mara said. "We want to ensure it does not resolve into submission," Vel said carefully. "There is a difference. Submission makes the galaxy a worse place for everyone who is not already at the top of its hierarchy, including us." Mara looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared for this meeting by imagining a dozen different versions of it, trying to anticipate what the Tessian would want and what they were actually offering. She had thought she was prepared, but there was something about this small, ancient being with his patient eyes and his ships full of stored memory that made her feel like she was standing at the beginning of something very large. "What can you give us?" she asked. "Information," Vel said. "We know where the Keth and Vorath border tensions are most acute. We know which Sural commanders disagreed with the elimination order and have since shown signs of moral uncertainty. We know the location of 3 human military installations that were placed in deep hiding before the attacks, on the orders of officers who saw what was coming before most people did. Those installations were never found." Mara kept very still. 3 hidden installations. The possibility that they were intact, stocked, perhaps even with crews in cryosuspension who had survived. That possibility felt like something she was not yet ready to let herself believe fully, because believing it, and having it turn out to be wrong, would be a particular kind of painful she could not afford right now. "And in return," she said. "In return," Vel said, "you survive, and you are careful. And when the time comes, you do what needs to be done in a way that does not simply create another cycle of destruction. The galaxy does not need another extinction. It needs justice. There is a difference." Mara looked at Soren. He gave her the slight nod that meant he had heard the important things, and was reserving judgment, but had not heard anything that made him want to leave. "We understand the difference," Mara said. She held Vel's gaze. "We've had 3 years to think about it." The archivist nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Then let us begin." Outside the dead system, in the cold between stars, the galaxy moved on, vast and indifferent, and sure of itself. The Keth and the Vorath maneuvered against each other at their border. The Sural counted their new territories. The Galactic Council held its sessions and made its announcements. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Nobody was watching one small pale ship and one dark warship floating quietly near a dead star. Nobody was listening to the two very different kinds of people sitting across from each other in a library-like room, speaking carefully about things that would take a long time to become real, but that, once real, could not be undone. Mara Voss had been a military officer for 14 years. She knew how to recognize the moment when a battle began. This one was beginning now, not with weapons, not with explosions, just with two people talking, and an exchange of information, and a question of whether the galaxy had been correct when it had decided that humanity was finished. She intended to answer that question. She had been working on the answer for 3 years, and she was not close to done yet, but she could see the shape of it now, the way you could see the shape of a storm forming before it arrived. She was patient. She had learned patience the hard way, but she was also very sure of what she was doing. The last human warship was alive, its commander was thinking, and the galaxy, which had decided the story was over, had not yet understood that it was the one who had made it a story worth telling. Humanity did not go quietly. It never had. That was, perhaps, exactly the quality that had made certain powerful civilizations decide it needed to be removed. They had been afraid of what humans might eventually become. They should have been more afraid of what a human might become, who had nothing left to lose, except the chance to make things right. Mara Voss walked back to the shuttle in the warm, dim corridors of the Tessian ship, with Soren and Rel and Jana around her, and her mind was already 3 steps ahead, working through possibilities, calculating paths, thinking about the 3 hidden installations, and what might be in them, and how to get there without being seen. The stars outside were still quiet, but quiet was not the same as peaceful. She knew that now better than she had ever known anything. The galaxy declared humanity extinct. Only one human warship survived. It came back for revenge. Part 2. The Hidden Places. The first hidden installation was called Anchor Point Zero. Nobody had used that name publicly in decades. It had been a classified project, funded through budget lines that described it as something else entirely, built by a small group of military strategists who had looked at the expanding tensions between humanity and the Galactic Council powers, and decided, quietly, carefully, without telling anyone above a certain clearance level, that it might be wise to have a fallback, a place that did not officially exist, a reserve of weapons, technology, personnel, and supplies that could not be found or destroyed because it was not, as far as anyone outside the project knew, there. The people who had built Anchor Point Zero had been right to be worried. They had simply been wrong about how fast things would go wrong, and how completely. Mara had the coordinates from Archivist Vel. She had spent 4 days verifying them against every piece of stellar cartography data she had, cross-referencing the location against known patrol routes, and Keth sensor coverage, and Vorath shipping lanes, making absolutely certain that the path to Anchor Point Zero was something they could travel without being seen. It was in a region of space that the galactic powers had largely ignored, a cluster of old, dim stars with no habitable worlds and no significant mineral deposits, the kind of area that surveyors marked as low interest and moved on from, the kind of area where something could be hidden if you were patient and careful about it. The journey took 11 days, 11 days of quiet running, of passive observation, of watching the signals around them for any sign that something had noticed them. The Endurance had been doing this for 3 years, and was very good at it. Petra had made modifications to the ship's emission profile over those years, small adjustments, carefully thought out, that made them look, to most sensor systems, like a piece of natural space debris, not invisible, just unremarkable, the kind of thing a sensor sweep would note and dismiss. On the 9th day of the journey, a Vorath patrol ship passed within 7,000 kilometers of them. That was close. Close enough that Mara had stood at the tactical station for 2 hours without sitting down, watching the patrol ship's signature on the passive display, watching it neither stop nor turn. It continued on its way. They had not been seen. When they finally reached the coordinates, there was nothing obvious to find. The location was a region between 2 very old, very cold red dwarf stars, with a scattered field of rocky debris, fragments of something that might have once been a small planet, broken up long ago by gravitational forces. The debris field was dense enough to make navigation slow and careful work, but not so dense as to be impassable. "I'm not reading anything," Den said from the communication station. "No active signals, no power emissions." "That's the point," Mara said. "Keep scanning. Go deep. Look for anything that's trying to look like natural rock." It took 6 hours of careful sensor work before they found it. Anchor Point Zero was not a station in the conventional sense. It was a collection of sealed chambers, built into and around 3 large asteroids that had been selected for their position relative to each other, linked by tunnels that ran through the rock itself. The whole structure was shielded, not just by its location and its passive state, but by materials built into the asteroid surfaces that absorbed and scattered sensor waves. From the outside, it looked like 3 rocks. From the inside, it was something else entirely. There was no crew. The installation had been built to operate unmanned in emergency hibernation mode, everything shut down to the absolute minimum required to keep the stored contents from degrading. The personnel who had been assigned to it, 43 men and women, were in cryo-suspension units, sleeping, waiting for a signal that had never come, because the people who were supposed to send it were dead. Mara took the shuttle over herself, with a team of 8 that included Petra and 2 of her engineers, a medical officer, and 4 security personnel. They docked with one of the installation's airlocks through a tunnel that took them through 15 meters of solid rock, a strange, close feeling, moving through a carved passage in an asteroid, with the rock pressing in from all sides, and only the lights they had brought cutting through the dark. The interior, once they reached it, was cold, not dangerously cold. The life support systems had maintained a minimum temperature, but the kind of cold that got into you slowly and reminded you that warmth was something that had to be actively maintained. Emergency lighting gave everything a dim orange glow. Petra moved to the main power console with the focused energy she always had when confronted with systems that needed to be woken up, and spent 30 minutes going through diagnostics while the rest of the team explored. What they found was extraordinary. The installation held weapons, not the standard-issue military equipment of a regular naval base, but next-generation systems that had been in advanced development stages when the attacks happened, directed energy weapons with a range and precision that exceeded anything currently fielded by the Keth or Vorath. Defensive shield generators that operated on a principle Mara had read about in classified research reports but had never seen in actual hardware. Torpedo systems with guidance packages so advanced they could track a target through most known jamming frequencies. It also held ships, not assembled, broken down into components and packed into sealed containers, ready to be transported and reassembled. The components for 4 warships of a class smaller than the Endurance but faster and more agile, designed as interceptors. The components for 12 smaller craft, not quite fighters but not quite shuttles either, something in between. Petra had looked at the specifications and had gotten very quiet for about 30 seconds, which was Petra's equivalent of speechlessness. And there was more. Data cores containing records from before the attacks, intelligence files, technical documents, communications that had never been publicly released, the private records of the people who had built this place and understood what was happening. Research into Keth military systems, analysis of Vorath strategic doctrine, years of careful observation by people who had been paying attention when most others had been looking away. Mara had sat in the cold orange light of the installation's main chamber and looked at what was around her and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not quite hope. Hope was too fragile a word for what she was experiencing. Something harder than hope. Something more like recognition. The people who had built this place had known. They had seen it coming, and they had planned ahead, and they had been right about everything, except how to survive long enough to use what they had prepared. She was going to use it for them. How long to get everything out? She asked Petra. Petra was consulting a storage manifest on her datapad. The weapons hardware, 2 to 3 days if we run shuttles continuously. The ship components, 6 to 8 days. The data cores we can start transferring immediately. And the people? Petra looked toward the cryo-suspension section. The medical team says the units are in good condition. They could start reviving the crew in 24 hours. But Commander, waking 43 people up from cryo is going to mean food, medical support, psychological care. We need to be prepared for that. We'll be prepared, Mara said. She thought about what it would be like for those 43 people to wake up and be told what they had missed. She thought about how she would explain it to them. There was no good way to explain it. There was only the truth, which was terrible, and the reason to go on, which was the only thing she had ever found that worked against terrible truth. Start the revival sequence on 2 units first, she said. The senior officers, whoever has the highest rank, I want to talk to them before the others wake up. The first person to come out of cryo was a man named Admiral Hendrik Sosa, who had been the commanding officer assigned to Anchor Point Zero at the time of the attacks. He was a large man in his late 50s, with gray at his temples and the solid, settled look of someone who had been making hard decisions for a long time. He came out of cryo slowly, the way everyone did, confused and weak and cold, his body fighting to remember how to be awake, and Mara waited by his unit, with a blanket and a cup of warm liquid, and the patience of someone who had spent 3 years learning to wait for things. He looked at her for a long time before he spoke. How long? He asked. 3 years, she said. His face did something complicated. He had known, before he went under, that things were bad. He had not known how bad. What's left? He asked. She told him. All of it. She did not soften it or slow down, or let herself become emotional about it. She just told him the facts, in order, clearly. She had learned that directness was the most respectful thing you could offer someone facing a terrible reality. False comfort or delays, or careful phrasing just made it worse. It made people feel like they were being managed, which was a small additional humiliation on top of the main one. He sat with it for a while. The medical officer, Dr. Rell, was monitoring his vitals, and Mara could see the numbers. His heart rate elevated, his blood pressure spiking, then slowly coming back down, as the man did whatever he needed to do internally to absorb what he had been told. She recognized the process. She had gone through her own version of it. When he looked at her again, his eyes were steady. You've been running for 3 years with 1 ship and 200 people, he said. 222, she said. We picked some up along the way. Something in his expression, not quite admiration, but related to it. And you have a plan. I have a plan, she confirmed. He nodded slowly. Tell me. She told him that too, all of it. The Tessian connection, the information about the Keth-Vorath border tensions, the identification of Sural commanders who had shown signs of moral doubt, and the larger strategic picture she had been building for 3 years. He listened without interrupting, and she could see his military mind working, processing, categorizing, the way experienced officers did when they were being briefed on a situation. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. It's a very long game, he said. Yes, she agreed. Most of it depends on things we can't control. The Keth-Vorath tensions escalating, the Tessian maintaining their willingness to help, the Sural defectors actually being willing to act when the time comes. Yes, she said again. A lot of it is dependent on things we can't control. That's true of most plans. He looked at her steadily. You've been carrying this alone for 3 years. Not alone, Mara said. I have good people. You do, he said. But the plan lives in your head. He paused. I want to understand it completely. I want to be the person who could continue it if something happened to you. Mara looked at him for a moment. 3 years of being the only person who held the whole picture. 3 years of knowing that if anything happened to her, the plan would fragment. She had not quite let herself think about that directly, because thinking about it directly meant thinking about her own death, and that was a thought she had been keeping at arm's length. I'd appreciate that, she said, which was an understatement. The second installation, the coordinates for which were in the data cores from Anchor Point 0, was called Refuge 11. It was 12 days' travel from their current position, in a completely different direction, tucked into a nebula that made sensor work difficult for everyone, including the people inside it. Refuge 11 was less militarily focused than Anchor Point 0 and more civilian. It had been designed as a place to preserve things. Data, culture, history, scientific records. Everything humanity had accumulated that could be condensed and stored. And, crucially, people. More than 200 civilians, mostly scientists and educators and historians, had been taken to Refuge 11 before the attacks and placed in cryosuspension. People who had been selected for the breadth and depth of what they knew. People chosen to carry the culture of humanity forward if the worst happened. The worst had happened, and Mara intended to reach them. The third installation the Tessian had mentioned, they had called it the Forge, was more distant and more dangerous to reach, located in a region where Keth patrol coverage was denser. She was leaving the Forge for later. She needed what was in Anchor Point 0 first, and then she needed to understand what was in Refuge 11, and then she needed to think carefully about how to approach the Forge without being caught. One step at a time. She had learned that too, over 3 years. The instinct to rush toward the goal was a dangerous one. The goal was large and far away, and could not be reached by running. It could only be reached by moving steadily and carefully, and making good decisions at each step of the path. While they worked on clearing the contents of Anchor Point 0, the data cores were already being analyzed on the Endurance. Mara had assigned 3 of her best analysts to go through everything systematically, flagging the most important material. There was a great deal of it. Years' worth of intelligence reports, intercepted communications, technical analyses. On the second day of the extraction work, one of the analysts, a young woman named Priya who had been a junior intelligence officer when the attacks happened, and who had in 3 years become very good at her job, came to Mara with a finding that made the cold thing in Mara's chest tighten. "There's a record here," Priya said. She was holding her data pad carefully, the way people held things when they were not quite sure how to present what was on them. "From about 8 months before the attacks. It's a transcript of a closed session of the Galactic Council." "And?" Mara prompted. "The vote on the elimination order," Priya said. "It wasn't unanimous." Mara went very still. "How many voted against?" 4 representatives, out of 31 on the full council. Priya looked at the pad. The Tessian representative voted against. So did the representative of the Halvan Collective, the Marathi Confederation, and 1 representative from the Sural Dominion, a minority faction that was overruled by the Sural majority. Mara took the pad and read the transcript herself. The language was formal and procedural and cold, the way official transcripts always were, stripping emotion from decisions that should have been agonizing. But the arguments of the 4 who had voted against were there, and reading them felt strange, like hearing the voices of people she had never met who had, nonetheless, tried to save her people. Who had sat in a room and said, "This is wrong, this cannot be right, we should not do this," and been outvoted. 4 votes out of 31. 27 civilizations had looked at humanity and decided it needed to be destroyed. 4 had said no. She thought about the Halvan Collective and the Marathi Confederation, both of them, according to what she knew, mid-sized civilizations with no strong military tradition, but significant economic and political influence in certain regions of the galaxy. She had not thought about them as potential allies before. She was thinking about them now. "Get me everything we have on the Halvan and the Marathi," she told Priya. "Current status, political alignment, relationship with the Keth and the Vorath and the Sural, everything." "On it," Priya said, and left quickly, which was one of the things Mara liked about her. On the 4th day at Anchor Point 0, the revived members of Admiral Sosa's crew began to come online one by one. weak and disoriented at first, needing medical attention, and food and time, but alive, and once the initial confusion passed, grateful in a way that was hard to watch and harder to receive. There was a moment when one of the women who had been revived, a young lieutenant named Kai who could not have been more than 28 when she went under, had taken Mara's hand in both of her own and pressed it tightly and said, "Thank you," with the complete sincerity of someone for whom those two words were not a formality, but the whole of what she meant. Mara had said, "You're welcome," and had kept her face steady and her voice level, and had waited until she was alone in the shuttle's head to allow herself to feel the weight of it. The Endurance was a ship of 222. After Anchor Point 0, it would be a ship of 265. They were growing. Slowly, carefully, the way you grew anything when the ground was difficult and the weather was uncertain, but growing. On the 6th day, as the last of the ship component containers were being loaded, Soren found her in the main chamber of the installation, sitting alone at the cold table where she had first briefed Admiral Sosa. "You should rest," he said. "I know," she agreed, without moving. He sat down across from her. In 3 years of being her first officer, and her closest thing to a friend in this situation, he had learned to do this, to sit with her, not always needing to talk, just occupying the same space, in a way that was more honest than words would have been. "We found something else," he said after a while. She looked at him. "In the data cores, a personal file from one of the people who built this place, a strategist named Commander Yun Pei. He wrote a document, not official, personal." Soren paused. He knew what was going to happen. He had been tracking the council votes and the Keth military buildup and the Vorath economic moves for years. He knew it was coming. "And?" Mara asked quietly. "He wrote about why he built this place. The weapons, the stored ships, those were for defense, for survival. But the data cores, the cultural records, the scientists in Refuge 11, those were for something else." Soren looked at her steadily. He wrote, "I am not doing this so that the survivors can fight back. I am doing this so that if we cannot fight back, at least we will not be forgotten. At least something of who we were will exist somewhere. And maybe one day, when the galaxy is ready to feel shame, there will be a record of what was done and who we were before it happened." The room was very quiet. But he also wrote, Soren continued, that he hoped the survivors who found this would not just preserve. He wrote that if there was any way to do more than just survive, if there was any real possibility of justice, then that was what he would want. Not revenge that created another cycle of destruction. Justice, a reckoning, something that made the galaxy understand what it had chosen to do. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Outside the asteroid, the cold stars were very far away and very old. "He sounds like someone I would have liked," she said finally. "He does," Soren agreed. "We're going to do both," Mara said. "Preserve and fight. The culture, the records, the people in Refuge 11, they come with us. They go somewhere safe. They continue. And we fight. And we make sure that at the end of it there's something worth preserving. Something humanity brought back into a galaxy that decided we were finished." Soren nodded. It was the nod he gave when something was settled, not just decided but settled, sunk into the bone. "Then let's get back to the ship," he said. "We have a long way to go." They did. Refuge 11 was 12 days away, the forge beyond that. And the real work, the slow, careful, patient work of building something large enough and sharp enough and true enough to matter, was barely begun. But the Endurance was moving, and the people on it were thinking, and in the data cores now loaded into their ship systems, there were years of information about the enemies who had tried to erase them, and in the cold installation behind them, there were the components of 4 more warships waiting to be reassembled. The galaxy had declared humanity extinct. The announcement had been calm and official and certain. It had been wrong. The last human warship flew on through the dark, and its commander held the shape of the future in her mind, the way you held something delicate but strong, carefully, firmly, with complete intention to keep it intact until she reached the place where she could put it down and let it become real. The stars watched. They did not care. They had seen species rise and fall for billions of years, and would see more after the current ones were dust. But between the stars, in the cold and the dark, the Endurance moved, and the people on it were alive, and they remembered everything. And memory, as Commander Yun Pei had understood, was not just a record of the past. It was the beginning of everything that came next. The galaxy declared humanity extinct. Only one human warship survived. It came back for revenge. Part 3. The Weight of Names. Refuge 11 was everything its name was not. The name suggested something temporary, something tucked away and waiting to be forgotten. The reality was a marvel, a series of interconnected chambers buried inside a rogue planetoid, a rock with no star to orbit, drifting alone through the dark between systems in slow, patient isolation. Someone had found it decades ago, had recognized what it was, a natural structure with deep caverns, stable geology, no seismic activity, and had quietly, over years, turned it into a place where things could be kept safe. The approach took longer than the journey itself, because the planetoid was surrounded by a debris field that required human navigation. No automated approach worked cleanly. Mara handled it herself, in the shuttle, with Soren watching the proximity sensors and calling out readings in a calm, steady voice. She had always been a good pilot. There was a kind of focus that flying required that she found useful, because it could not be argued with. You were either doing it correctly or you were not, and the physics did not care about your feelings. When they finally reached the airlock and got inside, the difference from Anchor Point 0 was immediate. This place was warm. Not uncomfortably so, just warm. The life support had been running at a higher capacity, and the chambers were larger, and someone had, somehow, arranged for the lighting to be full spectrum, rather than the emergency orange they had lived with for 6 days at the first installation. It made the whole place feel different, less like a bunker, more like somewhere people had intended to actually live. There were 217 people in cryo-suspension at Refuge 11. 217 people who had been placed here before the attacks, selected for what they knew and what they could preserve, and who had been sleeping through 3 years of catastrophe, while the universe outside changed beyond recognition. Among them was someone Mara had not expected to find. She had not dared to look for, had actively resisted checking the manifest that the installation's records contained, because she had been afraid of what she would find, or would not find. But Soren had looked. Soren had checked when she was not looking, because he was a good first officer, and a good friend, and he understood the things she could not do herself. He told her on the second day of the revival process. He came to her in the chamber where she had been reviewing tactical reports, and sat across from her the way he always did when he had something difficult to say, and he said, "Your sister is here." Mara put down the datapad very carefully. She had a sister named Lena, 5 years younger, who had been a marine biologist on one of the outer colony worlds. Mara had assumed she was dead. She had assumed it for 3 years, had held the assumption in place because she had to keep functioning, and she could not function if she allowed the grief of not knowing to be a constant presence. She had put Lena in the same place she had put her parents and her friends and her homeworld, in a kind of locked room in her mind where she acknowledged the loss without letting it operate. "Are you certain?" she asked. Her voice was completely level, which took more effort than anything else she had done that day. "I verified the ID record 3 times, Soren said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When can she be revived?" "The medical team says 12 hours from now." "All right." She picked the datapad back up. Her hands were steady. "I'll be there." He did not say anything else. He was smart enough to know when not to say anything else. The 12 hours were among the longest of Mara's life. She worked through them the way she worked through everything, steadily, with her attention on what was in front of her, not on the clock. But the clock was always there, at the edge of her awareness, counting down in a way she could not quite ignore. She thought about what it would mean if Lena came back wrong, if the cryo had damaged her, if the 3 years of suspension had left something broken that Dr. Rell could not fix. She thought about what it would mean to see her sister's face. She thought about what she was going to say, and then she stopped thinking about it, because planning what to say to someone who had been dead in your mind for 3 years was not a problem you could solve in advance. You just had to be there when it happened. Lena came out of cryo at 0400 ship time. Mara was there. She watched the unit open, and she watched Dr. Rell and his team do their work with the efficiency and gentleness they brought to every revival, and she stood back and let them work, and she waited. When Lena opened her eyes, dark eyes, the same shade as Mara's own, a family trait that their mother had also carried, she was confused and weak, the way everyone was. She looked around the room without recognition, trying to organize what she was seeing. Then her gaze found Mara, and she went very still. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lena said, in a voice that was rough from disuse, and barely above a whisper, "You look terrible." Mara let out a breath that she had been holding. She realized for some time. "You don't look great yourself." Lena closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was something different in her expression, the confusion beginning to organize itself into understanding, and the understanding beginning to organize itself into something much harder. "How bad?" Lena asked. "Very bad," Mara said, "but we're here. That means something." Lena looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me." Mara told her. The way she had told Admiral Sosa, clearly, directly, without false comfort. Lena listened, and Mara watched her face the way she always watched faces when she was saying something important, reading the responses there, grief, and then something that organized itself past grief into a determined kind of darkness. "All right," Lena said when Mara was done. Her voice was steadier than Mara had expected, but then, Lena had always been steadier than most people expected. She was the kind of person who processed things deeply and showed less of it on the surface than was actually happening inside. They were alike in that way. "What do you need from me?" It was exactly the right question. It was the question Mara had hoped she would ask, because it meant Lena had already moved from the grief to the purpose, which was the only direction worth moving. "Right now, rest," Mara said. "Later, I need every marine biologist who was selected for this installation. We have worlds we're going to need to understand, environments, ecologies. If we're going to reclaim anything of what we lost, it starts with understanding what those worlds were." Lena nodded, slowly. "And the broader plan?" "Later," Mara said, "when you're stronger." Lena looked at her with an expression that was very familiar. It was the expression she had been making since childhood when Mara tried to manage her too carefully. "I'm already stronger than I look," she said. "I always have been. Tell me now." Mara almost smiled. "You haven't changed." "Neither have you," Lena said, still trying to protect people from hard truths. "I'm not protecting you. I'm telling you to rest." "Which is protection." Lena settled back against the support pillow. "Fine, I'll rest. But tomorrow you tell me everything." "Tomorrow," Mara agreed. The process of reviving 217 people took 6 days. By the end of it, the Endurance and its accompanying vessels, they were traveling now with 2 of the converted freighters, loaded with the weapons and components from Anchor Point Zero, had gained a community. Not just additional military personnel or technical specialists, but a community. People with different knowledge and different backgrounds and different kinds of grief. All of them waking up into a situation none of them had quite imagined, but all of them had been, in different ways, preparing for. There were arguments. There were always arguments when you put that many frightened, grieving, newly awakened people together and told them the world they had known was gone, and here was the current situation. Some people wanted to go into deeper hiding. Some wanted to fight immediately, regardless of readiness. Some wanted to attempt contact with the Galactic Council, which Mara shut down with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. The Council had voted for the elimination order. The Council was not an avenue. The Council was part of the problem. Some people were simply lost. Not violent, not argumentative, just adrift. 3 years of cryosleep had not spared them the reality they woke up to, and some of them needed significant time just to function. Dr. Rell's small medical team was overwhelmed, and Mara had assigned a portion of the Refuge 11 scientists, those with relevant backgrounds, to assist with the psychological care of the newly revived. In the middle of all this, Admiral Sosa was invaluable. He had a different authority from Mara's, older, more institutional, the kind that people who had grown up trusting military hierarchy found familiar. He moved through the chaotic, grieving crowd of newly revived people, with a steadiness that Mara recognized and respected. answering questions plainly, acknowledging the grief without being drowned by it, redirecting people toward purpose without dismissing their pain. She watched him do it and thought, this is why the installation had a commander, not just for tactical reasons, because someone who could do this, who could hold a community together when the community had every reason to fall apart, was as important as any weapon. She also spent time during those 6 days going through the data from Refuge 11's own archives. The installation had been not just a refuge for people, but a vault of cultural materials: art, literature, music, scientific papers, historical records, things that could not be rebuilt from memory, things that existed only because someone had taken the time, before the worst happened, to copy them and store them somewhere safe. There was a section she found herself returning to. It was a collection of personal testimonies, not official statements or historical records, but the words of ordinary people. A project, it seemed, that had been organized in the months before the attacks by a historian named Dr. Oren Tal, who had understood what was coming, and had spent those final months asking people to record themselves, just talking, saying who they were, where they lived, what they loved, what they hoped for. Hundreds of recordings. She sat alone in a quiet section of the installation and listened to some of them. A woman who had lived on a coast and gone sailing every weekend, and made a soup that her children had loved since they were small. A man who had taught mathematics to teenagers for 30 years, and who talked about the specific joy of watching a student understand something for the first time. A girl who was maybe 15, and who talked about her best friend, and the way they laughed at things that nobody else thought were funny. They were gone. All of them. Gone. Their worlds gone. The specific joy of understanding mathematics for the first time. The specific taste of a soup made with love and repetition. The specific laughter between two friends that belonged only to them. All of it gone. Mara listened until she could not listen anymore, and then she sat in the quiet and let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying, which she did not do often, because the full weight would have made it hard to walk, and she needed to walk. But sometimes, alone, she allowed it. She owed the people in those recordings at least that, to actually feel it, not just register it and move on. When she came back to the central chamber, Soren looked at her once, and did not say anything. He knew where she had been. He understood. "Progress report," she said, which was how she brought herself back. He gave it to her. The ships were being loaded. The revival of Refuge 11's population was 80% complete. Petra had begun the preliminary assessment of the Forge's approach route. Archivist Vel had sent a signal through the agreed channel. More information, this time about something more specific and more urgent. "What did he find?" Mara asked. "A Sural commander named Fleet Commander Dara Osen," Soren said. "One of the officers who voted, internally, against the elimination order. She's now in charge of administration for 3 of the former human colony worlds. And according to the Tessian archives, she's been in covert communication with the Marathi Confederation." Mara's attention sharpened. What kind of communication? Unofficial, non-military. The Tessian describe it as exploratory dialogue on the question of historical accountability. Soren raised an eyebrow slightly, which is diplomatic language for, she may be looking for a way to do something about what happened. This was significant. A Sural commander, in charge of former human territories, in unofficial communication with one of the civilizations that had voted against the elimination order. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, potentially something quite large. "We need to find a way to contact her," Mara said. "Without exposing ourselves to Soral military response," Soren agreed. "Which means going through the Tessian again, and it means taking our time." "We take our time," Mara said. "We're good at that." The fleet, if 3 vessels could be called a fleet, moved on from Refuge 11 after the 9th day. They carried now nearly 500 people, an enormous expansion of what had been 213 for 3 years. It was a different kind of ship now, or a different kind of small flotilla, not just a military vessel running in silence, but something closer to a community, still frightened, and still grieving, but beginning to organize itself around purpose. Admiral Sosa and Mara had worked out a command structure that respected both of their authorities without creating confusion. She was the commander of the Endurance and the overall mission, He was the senior flag officer of the recovered personnel and had particular responsibility for the integration of the Anchor Point Zero crew. It worked, partly because Sosa was not a man who cared much about status, and partly because he had seen enough of Mara's work to understand that this was her plan, and her 3 years of preparation that had made any of this possible. He told her that directly, once, in a private conversation that neither of them ever referred to again in front of others. "You built this," he said. "You kept it together when there was no reason to think anything would survive. I want you to know I understand that. You built the things we needed," she said. "You and Commander Yunpei, and the people who made those installations. You gave us something to find. Neither of us did it alone." He nodded, accepting that. They were, she thought, well matched for this. Two people who were clear-eyed about their own importance and other people's, who did not need credit in order to keep working. On the 4th day of travel toward the forge, something happened that they had not planned for. Den called from the communications station, and his voice had the particular pitch it got when something was both urgent and unclear. "Commander, I'm picking up a signal, very faint, old encryption, human military encryption." Mara was at the tactical station in 40 seconds. She looked at the signal analysis on Den's screen, and she felt the same thing she felt every time something genuinely unexpected happened. A settling, a going quiet inside, while her mind ran through what she was seeing. The signal was definitely human military. The encryption was a standard naval code, not classified, but not civilian either. It was old. The timestamp on the originating transmission showed it had been sent 4 months after the attacks. It had been bouncing, she realized, traveling through the interstellar medium in a direction that had no likely recipient, just heading outward in the hope that something might eventually be in the right place to catch it. They were in the right place. The message, when they decoded it, was from a man named Lieutenant Commander Brix. He had been the commanding officer of a small automated research station, the kind of installation that studied deep space phenomena and had no military capacity. He had been aboard with a crew of 7 when the attacks happened, and they had survived because the station was so small and so far out that it had simply not been noticed. They had been drifting, with minimal power, for 3 years. Their food synthesis was failing. They had perhaps 2 months left. He had sent the message not because he expected anyone to receive it, but because, as he wrote at the end, "I refused to disappear without saying that we were here, that we existed, that we were human beings who did our work and tried to do it well, and we did not deserve what happened to us. And even if no one ever reads this, I want it to be said." Mara read that last line 3 times. "Get me a course," she told Soren, "and tell Petra I need the engines at full efficient output for as long as she can sustain it. We're going to get them." "It takes us off the route to the forge," Soren said. "I know," Mara said. "We're going to get them." Nobody argued. She had expected someone might. The detour was significant, and the forge was important, and every additional movement increased the risk of detection. But nobody argued, because the thing Lieutenant Commander Brix had written at the end of his transmission, the refusal to disappear unacknowledged, was the same thing all of them were doing, every day, just by still being alive. And they were not going to leave 8 more people to die in the dark, because the route was inconvenient. The Endurance changed course. It flew through the cold between stars, carrying its community of nearly 500 people, heading toward 8 strangers who had been waiting for 3 years for someone to hear them. The galaxy had decided humanity was over. The Galactic Council had made its announcement and moved on to other business. The Keth had built on what they had taken. The Vorath had stripped what they needed. The Sural had settled into the empty spaces. And out in the dark, where nobody was watching, the last of humanity flew toward each other and kept what they carried alive, and planned, and grieved, and worked, and did not, under any circumstances, give up. Because that was what they were. Not a species defined by its wars or its mistakes or the things that had been done to it. A species that, when told it was finished, looked up at the stars and said, "We are not done yet. We have something left to do. We remember who we were, and we know who we want to be, and we are going to find a way to make that real." Even if it took a very long time, even if the way forward was uncertain, even if everything else had been taken away, The stars watched, the dark continued, and the Endurance flew on. The galaxy declared humanity extinct. Only one human warship survived. It came back for revenge. Part 4. The Forge and the Fire. The Forge was the most dangerous of the 3 installations to reach, and the most important of the 3 to find. And it was guarded, not by its builders, who were gone, but by time and circumstance, and the fact that the Keth had, in the 3 years since the attacks, established a significant military presence in the surrounding region. It had been built to produce things, not to store them, not to preserve them, but to create them. It was a manufacturing facility, hidden inside a large moon, orbiting a gas giant in a system the Keth now used as a staging area for their border operations with the Vorath. The moon itself was unremarkable, rocky, airless, no resources worth extracting. The Keth installations were on the gas giant's other moons, around the planet's rings, at the system's outer edge. The manufacturing moon sat in between all of them, apparently empty, apparently ignored. Apparently. The approach required more planning than anything they had done before. Mara spent 2 weeks on it. 2 weeks of studying the Keth patrol patterns, the sensor coverage from their installations, the gaps and rhythms of their activity. She had Priya and 2 other analysts working alongside her, building a model of the Keth presence in the system, so detailed that they could predict, to within about 20 minutes of accuracy, where any given patrol ship would be at any given time. During those 2 weeks, they also recovered Lieutenant Commander Brix and his crew of 7. The reunion, if it could be called that, was quiet. The 8 people from the research station came aboard the Endurance, looking like they had been through something. Thin, pale, a little stunned by the number of people they found. Brix himself was a small, precise man of about 40, with wire-framed reading glasses that he wore pushed up on his forehead even when he was not reading, which Mara found endearing in a way she could not have explained. He had kept his crew together for 3 years in a failing station by doing something that turned out to be similar to what she had done. He had given them work to do, had found reasons for each of them to be engaged with something purposeful, and had refused to let the situation become simply about waiting to die. "You got my message," he said to Mara when they met in the corridor outside the medical bay where his crew was being assessed. "We got your message," she said. He looked at her steadily. There was something in his expression that was very close to the edge of something. Not quite tears, but in the vicinity. "I didn't actually think anyone would." "I know," Mara said. "I'm glad you sent it anyway." He pushed his glasses up his forehead, which he apparently did when he was organizing his thoughts. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I mean, what's the plan?" She told him the broad outlines, the way she had told everyone who had joined them. He listened carefully, and the expression on his face moved through several things: surprise, calculation, and then a kind of quiet determination. "Can I be useful?" he asked. "I imagine so," she said. "What do you know?" "I'm a deep space phenomenon researcher," he said, "which isn't immediately militarily useful, but I was also, before that, a systems engineer. And the station I was on for 3 years was small enough that I had to fix everything myself." He paused. "I've gotten very good at making things work with limited resources in difficult conditions." "That," Mara said, "is extremely useful." She took him to meet Petra. The 2 of them, within 4 hours of meeting, were deep in a technical conversation about the modification of the Endurance's propulsion systems, which Brix had some thoughts about, and Petra had opinions about every aspect of. Mara left them to it and went back to the planning for the Forge. The approach to the Forge required that they split up. The Endurance, as a warship, was too large and too distinctive to move quietly through a system with active Keth sensor coverage. But a small shuttle, running dark and cold, moving through the dead zone between the gas giant's inner moon fields, that was a different matter. Small enough to be hard to detect. Cold enough to look like debris if something did ping it. Moving slowly enough not to trigger motion detection thresholds. Mara was going to fly it herself. Soren had objected. Admiral Sosa had objected. Even Petra, who was not usually in the business of objecting to tactical decisions above her pay grade, had said, "Is this really necessary, Commander?" in the tone she used when she had an opinion. "Yes," Mara had said, to all of them. The real reason was not tactical, though the tactical argument, That Mara was the best pilot they had, which was true, was a good cover. The real reason was that she needed to see the forge herself. Not through sensor data or photographs or reports. She needed to put her hands on it. She needed to see what was there, and make her own judgment about how to use it, because the next phase of the plan depended on the forge, in ways that were too important to trust to second-hand information. She also, though she would not have said this to anyone, needed to do something that felt real. 3 years of patience. 3 years of planning and thinking, and waiting, and managing, and holding everyone together. She needed a moment of pure action that was just about her and her skill, and what she was doing with her own hands. She flew in alone, at 0200 ship time, in a shuttle, with its emissions profile reduced to almost nothing, through a gap in the Keth patrol schedule that was 18 minutes long. She had 12 minutes of buffer on each end, which was more than enough for the passage itself, and not at all comfortable from a psychological standpoint. The moon's surface was dark and rough, the kind of terrain that would have made walking difficult and made hiding things easy. The forge's entrance was exactly where the coordinates said it would be. A hatch set into the rock face of a ridge, indistinguishable from the natural stone around it, unless you were within 50 meters, and looking for it specifically. Mara was within 20 meters and looking very specifically. She went in. What she found inside was not, in the conventional sense, beautiful. The forge was functional in the way that factories were functional. Practical, organized around efficiency, full of machinery and workspace and storage rather than comfort. But it was operating. 3 years of total isolation had not killed it. The automated systems had kept everything at minimum power, not running, but ready to run. The equipment was intact. The raw materials stored in the forge's lower levels were preserved. And the equipment was extraordinary. The forge had been designed for one specific purpose: to produce, at speed and scale, weapons and components that human forces would need in a prolonged conflict with superior enemies. The people who had designed it had understood that humanity might someday face a situation where it was outmatched and needed to compensate through technology and quantity. They had built a facility capable of producing things that no other manufacturing plant in human space had been equipped to make. Things like the drives they had developed to power the 4 interceptors stored at Anchor Point Zero, a propulsion system that could reach velocities that Keth and Vorath military doctrine assumed were impossible for a vessel of that size. Things like the directed energy weapons whose range and precision she had found at the first installation, but now in numbers. Enough components stored here to equip 12 warships, not 4. Things like a new generation of electronic warfare systems, signal dampeners, ghost generators, systems that could make a ship appear to be something it was not, or make it appear to be in multiple places at once. And in a sealed sublevel, under a level of security that took her 40 minutes to work through even with the access codes from the data cores, she found something that made her stand in the middle of the cold room for a long moment, just looking. 7 fully assembled warships. Not components, ships, ready, waiting. They were smaller than the Endurance, faster, more agile, built on a different design philosophy that prioritized speed and maneuverability over heavy armor. They had been placed here, fully operational, before the attacks. They were, as far as she could assess from a visual inspection and a quick systems check on the nearest one, in perfect condition. She ran a hand along the hull of the nearest one. The metal was cold and smooth. She thought about the people who had built this, who had placed these ships here in secret hoping that something would survive to use them, who had been so afraid of what was coming that they had built a whole hidden infrastructure of survival and had been right to be afraid, and had not survived to see any of it being used. "We're using it," she said aloud to the empty room. Her voice was very quiet in the cold. "We found it, and we're using it. Thank you." She spent 3 hours in the forge, moving through every section, cataloging, assessing, making decisions. When she flew back out, through the patrol gap with 3 minutes to spare, she was carrying in her head a complete picture of what was available and what she intended to do with it. The next 6 weeks were the hardest work they had done since before the attacks, in a different way from the running and the hiding. This was construction work. They could not bring the Endurance into the Keth patrolled system, so the work had to happen at a distance. Small, careful runs, shuttles moving equipment, and people in and out of the forge through patrol gaps. The work of Petra's engineering teams accelerated to a pace that made Mara worry about the physical toll it was taking. The 7 ships in the forge were crewed. That required people, and training, and time, and Mara spent a significant amount of it working with Admiral Sosa on crew assignments, who had the right background, who was ready to be trusted with a warship, how to build command structures quickly for people who had not served together before. During those 6 weeks, 3 things also happened on the diplomatic front that changed the shape of everything. The first was that the Keth-Vorath border tensions broke into open conflict. Not a declared war, the 2 powers were still officially at peace, but a series of incidents that the Tessian had predicted and that Mara had been watching for. A Keth patrol ship destroyed by what the Vorath called a rogue defense system, a Vorath trading post raided by what the Keth claimed was a pirate group with no affiliation, and then a larger incident involving a disputed moon that both sides had wanted for years, and neither had been willing to formally claim. 3 incidents in 4 weeks, each one more serious than the last. The second was that Fleet Commander Dara Osen of the Sural Dominion made contact. Not directly, not with humanity, which she might not have believed was still a category to make contact with. She made contact with the Murathi Confederation through a channel that was quiet and unofficial, and she said things that the Murathi passed along to the Tessian, who passed them along to Mara through their channel. What she said, stripped of the layers of diplomatic language, was this: what we did was wrong. I voted against it and was overruled. I am now in a position where I have been given authority over worlds that used to belong to people we destroyed, and I do not know how to live with that in a way that makes sense to me. If there is any way to begin a conversation about what happened and what can be done, I would hear it. It was not an offer of alliance. It was not even close to being a practical commitment of any kind, but it was a crack in the wall, and Mara, who had been looking for cracks for 3 years, knew what to do with cracks. The third thing was that the Halvan Collective reached out to the Tessian with a proposal. The Halvan were a quiet, non-military civilization who had nevertheless built one of the most sophisticated legal traditions in the galaxy. Their representative on the Galactic Council had voted against the elimination order, and they were now, apparently, prepared to formally challenge that order at the Council, not on the grounds that humanity had survived, they did not know that yet, but on the grounds that the legal amendments made to permit the elimination had been procedurally invalid, that the vote had been corrupted by economic pressure from the Keth and Vorath, that the entire thing, from start to finish, had been built on a framework of illegal manipulation. The challenge would likely fail. The Council was controlled by the same powers who had organized the attacks, and they would simply outvote any legal challenge. But that was not the point. The point was that the challenge would be public. It would force a formal debate. It would put into the official record of galactic governance the argument that what had been done to humanity was illegal and wrong, and it would, as the Halvan representative had apparently put it to the Tessian, show the galaxy that not everyone agreed, and that the agreement that was recorded was not the truth of what happened. Mara read the report of this 3 times, sitting in her quarters in the Endurance, which were exactly as small as they had always been, with the photograph of her parents still on the shelf and the worn notebook still on the desk. She thought about Commander Yunpei, who had wanted justice, not just survival. She thought about Dr. Orenthal and his recordings of ordinary people. She thought about the 27 civilizations that had voted yes, and the 4 that had voted no, and what the difference between those 2 groups said about the nature of moral courage in the face of power. She thought about what winning actually looked like, not in the narrow sense, not just revenge, not just striking back, though striking back was part of it, in the larger sense, what the world, what the galaxy, looked like if this actually worked, if the long, patient, careful plan came together, if the Keth and the Vorath, divided against each other, made mistakes that could be exploited, if the Sural, guided by someone like Dara Osen, who was already halfway to the right side, could be moved, if the Halvan's legal challenge created the public record that changed how the galaxy understood its own history. It was not a simple picture. It was not a story where the good guys won in a final battle and everything was resolved. It was something harder and more real than that, a slow reckoning, a gradual change in what was understood and what was permitted. a rebuilding that would take generations and would never fully replace what had been lost. But it was possible. That was what she had not allowed herself to believe for a long time, not hoped for. Hope was too fragile, but understood, with the cold, clear part of her mind that was never wrong about tactical possibilities, as genuinely possible. The 7 ships from the forge were christened. The ceremony was simple. Mara had insisted on simple, partly because there were not the resources for anything elaborate, and partly because elaborate felt wrong. Felt like celebrating when the people they were celebrating for were dead, but they needed names. Ships needed names. She let the crew choose them. Each ship was crewed by 30 to 40 people, and each crew voted on their ship's name. The results, when they came in, were not military names. They were not names of battles or famous vessels or abstract ideals. They were the names of places. 7 places, 7 cities, or regions, or particular spots on particular worlds that no longer existed. Heron Bay, the Terrace Plateau, the city of Madara, the Ren Valley, Allos Beach, the Kirin Islands, New Salent. Mara approved them all. She understood exactly what the crews were saying with those names. We are going out in these ships, and we carry those places with us. We have not forgotten. We will not forget. When we fight for what those places were, and for what the people who lived in them deserved. She stood at the launch observation window of the Endurance and watched the 7 ships move out of the forge's launch bay, one by one, small and quick and dark against the stars. They were beautiful in the way that things made for a specific hard purpose were beautiful. They were not decorative, they were exact, they were ready. The fleet, the word felt different now, felt real, was 8 ships, the Endurance, and Heron Bay, and the Terrace Plateau, and the city of Madara, and the Ren Valley, and Allos Beach, and the Kirin Islands, and New Salent. Plus the 2 converted freighters that were not warships but could carry weapons and supplies, plus the flotilla of smaller craft from Anchor Point Zero. It was not a force that could simply charge at the combined military might of the Keth Empire, the Vorath Alliance, and the Sural Dominion. That was not the point. That had never been the point. But it was a force that could do what needed to be done, carefully, precisely, at the right time in the right place, in a way that was part of something larger. The galaxy had declared humanity extinct. It had made its announcement and moved on. It had not been watching the dark carefully enough. Mara Voss stood at the observation window of the last human warship, in a fleet of 9 ships and 512 people, and looked at the stars with the expression that her crew had come to recognize, the one that was not quite a smile, but was not a smile either, the one that meant she had looked at the problem from every angle and had found the path through. It was time to make the galaxy understand what it had done, not just feel it, understand it, not just suffer consequences, face a reckoning. She was ready. They were ready. The fleet moved. The galaxy declared humanity extinct. Only 1 human warship survived. It came back for revenge. Part 5. The Reckoning. The war between the Keth Empire and the Vorath Alliance began on a Tuesday, by human reckoning, in the 42nd month after the Galactic Council had declared humanity extinct. It began with a Keth strike on 3 Vorath installations along their contested border. Not a limited action, not a provocation designed to be walked back, but a full and declared act of military force. The Keth Empire announced that it had evidence the Vorath had been funding insurgent groups inside Keth territory for the last year, and that it would no longer tolerate the arrangement. The Vorath denied everything, and then, 48 hours later, they launched their own strikes, much larger than the Keth action, strikes that hit deep into Keth territory, at military positions that could only have been identified through long-term intelligence gathering, strikes that told everyone who was paying attention that this had not been a sudden decision, that the Vorath had been preparing for this for a long time. Mara had been watching it build for months. She had known, with a precision that she allowed herself a certain private satisfaction in, almost exactly when it would break. She had not planned for it to happen in a specific week. You could not plan the internal politics of 2 major galactic powers with that kind of accuracy. But she had known the direction, and she had known the scale, and she had positioned the fleet accordingly. The fleet was spread across 3 systems, none of them in the immediate area of the Keth-Vorath conflict. They were watching, they were waiting, and they were in communication, through the Tessian network and through their own secured channels, with 3 different parties who were also watching and waiting. Fleet Commander Dara Osen of the Sural Dominion had, over the previous 4 months, moved from being a covert voice in quiet channels to being something more active. Mara had not communicated with her directly. The risk of that exposure was still too high, but through the Tessian, and then through Marathi intermediaries, a dialogue had developed that was real, even if it was slow and careful, and hedged on every side with deniability. Osen had agreed to 3 things. First, that the Sural Dominion would not intervene in the Keth-Vorath conflict in support of either side. Second, that she would use her administrative authority over the former human worlds to delay any further development of those territories for a period she described as pending legal review, a bureaucratic mechanism that could be maintained for at least a year. Third, that if and when the Halvan Collective's legal challenge came to a formal council session, she would speak in support of it rather than against it, at personal political risk. That third commitment had taken the longest to secure. It was the most dangerous for her. It was also the most important. The Halvan Collective had filed their legal challenge 2 weeks before the Keth-Vorath War broke out. The timing was not accidental. Mara had suggested it through the Tessian, and the Halvan had agreed that a council session scheduled during the early chaos of a war between 2 of the 3 powers that had organized the genocide was strategically sound. The third power, the Sural, would be distracted by the conflict on their borders and by the internal politics of Osen's faction. The challenge was formally lodged with the council's administrative body on a day when half the council representatives were in emergency session about the Keth-Vorath War, and the other half were trying to reach those representatives. The administrative body was obligated by its own rules to acknowledge and schedule the challenge within 30 days. It did so because the rules required it, even though the powers that ran the council would have preferred that it not. Mara received the confirmation of the scheduling through the Tessian channel. She was on the bridge of the Endurance when it came. She read it twice. Then she said to Soren, who was at the tactical station, Phase 2. He nodded. He went to the communications console and began transmitting a series of coded signals to the other 8 ships in the fleet, and to 2 contacts at the Halvan Collective, and to Archivist Vel's ship, which had been shadowing the fleet for the past 2 months. Phase 2. The Endurance and its fleet moved into the region near the Keth-Vorath conflict. Not into the conflict itself, not yet. Into the edge of it, where the signals were dense, and the attention of both powers was focused inward on each other, rather than outward, on what might be happening in the spaces between. In a war, both sides watch each other. They watch each other very carefully, and very urgently, and in doing so, they create gaps in their attention to everything else. The fleet moved through those gaps like water through cracks. Their first action was not an attack, it was a broadcast. Mara had spent 6 months composing it. Not the military and diplomatic content that had been shaped with input from Sosa and Priya and the Tessian and the Halvan's legal team, but the opening, the part that was just her, speaking to the galaxy as itself. That part had taken 6 months of quiet nights and worn notebooks, and the kind of thinking that could not be rushed. She recorded it in the Endurance's small communications room, with Soren and Den present, because she wanted witnesses. She sat in front of the camera with no uniform decoration, no formal posture, just herself, her gray eyes, and her dark hair, and the face that had gotten older in 3 years, in ways that she knew and did not mind. She spoke in standard galactic common, which was understood by every civilization in the known galaxy, and she said, "My name is Commander Mara Voss, of the Human Galactic Navy. 3 years and 42 days ago, the Galactic Council declared my species extinct. They were incorrect. I am speaking to you now from the bridge of a human warship. We are not extinct. We have survived, and we have found each other, and we are here. I want to be clear about why we are making this known now, and what we intend. We are not making this transmission to threaten anyone. We are not declaring war. We are not announcing an attack. We are announcing that we exist, that we remember everything that was done to us, and that we have the capacity to respond to it, and that we are choosing not to respond to it in the way that you might fear. because we are not the kind of people who answer genocide with genocide. We are announcing something else instead. We are supporting the legal challenge filed by the Halvan Collective at the Galactic Council. We are asking every civilized species in this galaxy, every one of you who looked at what the Council authorized and felt that it was wrong, to ask your governments to also support that challenge. Not because it will succeed, it may not succeed, but because what is recorded in the history of this galaxy matters, because whether we acknowledge the truth of what was done, or allow that truth to be buried under legality and official silence, matters. We were not an experiment. We were not a threat to be eliminated. We were people. We are people. And the galaxy will not be the place you want it to be for your children, if it becomes a place where that fact can simply be erased and moved past without consequence. This is our message. We are here. We remember. And we are watching. She stopped the recording. She looked at Soren. He had an expression she had not seen on his face in 3 years, something that was very close to relief, as though a weight had finally been put down somewhere it could rest. The broadcast went out on every frequency they could reach, encrypted against interception but designed to be interceptable. They wanted it found. It went to the Tessian network, which distributed it to every civilization that network touched. It went to the Halvan and the Marathi. It went to the general galactic broadcast frequencies that the Council used for its own announcements. It went, on the specific frequency she had identified through Priya's intelligence work, directly to the command channel of Fleet Commander Dara Osen. And then Mara went to the tactical display and began the operational phase. The operational phase was not a frontal assault. It was not a heroic last charge by 8 ships against the fleets of 3 galactic powers. That was a story that ended in 5 minutes and accomplished nothing. The operational phase was something more calculated and more damaging. It was a series of precise strikes against specific targets, chosen not for their military value, but for their symbolic and political value. The Endurance and the fleet hit 4 locations. The first was the Keth Military Command Center on the former human colony world of Heron. Not to destroy the facility, but to breach it, to demonstrate that it could be breached, and to pull from its databanks a record of Keth communications from the year before the attacks. Communications that showed in explicit detail the coordination between the Keth, the Vorath, and the Sural leadership in planning the genocide. Communications that had never been made public. Communications that showed, in the actual words of the people who had organized the murder of billions, exactly what they had done and why. The second was the Vorath Administrative Archive at the edge of what had been the human colonial territory, struck precisely, with minimal collateral damage, to extract a similar set of records. The Vorath Archive was more heavily protected, and the strike cost them. Alo's Beach, one of the 7 new ships, was badly damaged in the extraction. 14 people were injured. None were killed, which Mara had been specifically holding as a goal, not because Vorath casualties did not matter to her strategically, but because she had promised herself this would be done with as little new death as possible, and she had meant it. The third target was not a military location. It was the Sural Dominion's public broadcasting relay station in the neutral space near the former human border, and they did not destroy it. They used it. They transmitted the extracted Keth and Vorath communications, plus the records from the Tessian archives, plus the transcript of the Galactic Council's closed session vote on the elimination order, plus Dr. Orental's recordings, the voices of ordinary people, the woman with her soup, the mathematics teacher, the young girl who talked about her best friend. They broadcast all of it on every frequency the relay could reach, to every corner of the galaxy it could touch. The fourth action was the most personal. The Endurance, alone, flew to the coordinates of Heron, the world where Mara had grown up, one of the destroyed human colony worlds that the Sural had now resettled. She did not attack it. She flew into orbit, and she stayed there, visible, for 4 hours. The Sural garrison on the surface would have seen her coming. They would have tracked her. They would have had 4 hours to call for support and to wonder what she was going to do. She did nothing except exist in orbit above the world where she had been born, which was no longer what it had been, but which still had the same mountains and the same coastlines, because those things take longer than 3 years to erase. She looked at it through the observation window for those 4 hours. The continent where the beach in her parents' photograph had been, the shape of the southern landmass, which she knew from childhood, the particular color of the ocean in the northern hemisphere, which was almost the same blue-green it had always been, because the ocean did not care what the Surel Dominion had decided. She did not cry. She had done her crying, alone and in private, in the ways she had allowed herself over 3 years. What she felt now was different from grief. It was something steadier, something that recognized what was gone, and held it clearly, and did not look away, and also recognized what was still present. Her own self, her own intention, the people on the ship around her who had carried this with her. She thought about her parents smiling on that beach. She thought about Lena, who was now on the Endurance, who had spent the last weeks helping establish what they were calling the Archive, the cultural preservation project that would carry the records and the knowledge of human civilization forward, regardless of what happened in the military and political sphere. Lena had approached that work with the same steadiness she brought to everything, the kind of steadiness that Mara had always secretly relied on, even when she thought she was doing it alone. She thought about Commander Yunpei and his wish for justice rather than just survival. She thought about the woman with her soup and the mathematics teacher, and the girl with her best friend. After 4 hours, she left. The Endurance moved away from Heron, and the Surel garrison was still there, and the resettled population was still there, and nothing had been destroyed. She had come to look, and she had come to be seen, and she had come to say, not in words but in the simple fact of her presence, we were here. We are still here. This was ours and you are on it. And you know what was done to make that possible. And that knowledge is now your burden to carry. The broadcast had gone out. The records were everywhere. The Halvan Challenge was on the Council's schedule. The Keth-Vorath War was consuming both of those powers. And Dara Osen had, in the 48 hours following Mara's broadcast, made a public statement, not covert any longer, public, in which she said that the Surel Dominion's participation in the elimination action had been wrong, that she had opposed it at the time, and that she called on the Surel government to support the Halvan legal challenge. That statement had already cost Osen. Mara did not know what the internal consequences were yet. She did not know if Osen would be removed from her position, or censured, or worse. She knew that Osen had made that statement knowing those risks, and had made it anyway. That mattered. That was the kind of thing that changed what was possible in a galaxy. The fleet reassembled at a prearranged location in the outer edge of a quiet system. The Endurance, Heron Bay, the Terrace Plateau, Madara, the Ren Valley, Kirin Islands, New Salent, and Alos Beach, which was being repaired, slowly but well, Petra having looked at the damage with the expression of someone who had been personally insulted by shrapnel. They were all there. Mara called all ship commanders together on the secured channel, not just the military commanders, the science leads, the archive leads, the people who were managing the community aspects of what they were building. She looked at the faces on the screen, some of whom she had known for years and some of whom she had known for weeks, all of whom she trusted with the only thing she had left to trust anyone with. We are not done, she said. I want to be clear about that. The Halvan Challenge will take months to work through the council process, and it may fail. The Keth-Vorath War will end eventually, and we don't know in what shape either of them emerges. The Sural's internal politics are moving in ways we can see the surface of, but not the depth. There is a long way still to go. She paused. But something has changed, something that cannot be changed back. The galaxy knows we are alive. The records of what was done to us are out there now, in the hands of every species that received that broadcast, and you cannot unreceive something. There are people on 100 worlds who are hearing the voice of that mathematics teacher tonight, or reading the transcript of a council session that was supposed to be secret forever, and they are deciding what they think about it. Some of them will decide that it doesn't concern them. Some of them will find reasons why what the Keth and Vorath and Surel did was understandable or justified, but some of them will feel what they should feel, which is that what was done was wrong, and those people will remember. She looked at the faces. She looked at Soren, who was steady as always. At Sosa, who had the expression of a man who had lived long enough to understand that some victories look small and contain large things. At Lena, who caught her eye and held it for a moment, with a look that said more than words. We are going to build something, Mara said. Not just survive. Build. The archive continues. The technical work continues, the diplomacy continues, and the fleet stays ready, because we may need it again, and we will be prepared if we do. But we are building something that lasts beyond any single battle, beyond any single political outcome. We are building the evidence that humanity existed, and the proof that it was wrongly destroyed, and the demonstration that it refused to be finished. She stopped. There was quiet on the channel. Then Admiral Sosa said quietly, "Commander Yunpei would have approved." "He would," she agreed. She ended the channel. She sat in the captain's chair of the Endurance, not the small quarters, not the observation window, but the chair itself, which she had sat in for 3 years, and which had come to feel like something earned, and she was quiet for a while. Den said, from the communication station, more responses coming into the broadcast. "Tell me," she said. "Marathi Confederation, official statement. They endorse the Halvan Challenge and call on other council members to do the same." He paused. 7 other small species delegations, same position. And, he stopped. "And," Mara said, "something from inside Sural space, not an official channel, a private frequency, encrypted." He looked up at her. "It's addressed to you personally." She went to the communications console and decoded the message herself, slowly, because her hands were not quite steady, in a way she was not going to explain to anyone. The message was short. It said, "Commander Voss, I don't know if you'll receive this, but I'm sending it anyway, because someone once taught me that it matters to say true things, even if you don't know who will hear them. My name is Dara Osen. I am sorry for what was done to your people. I know that sorry is a very small word for a very large thing. I intend to spend the rest of my career making it mean something. I hope you survive what comes next. I hope you get to see the day when this galaxy understands what it chose to do. If there is anything I can do to help make that day come, tell me. I will do it." Mara read the message 3 times. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she went back to the captain's chair and sat down in it with the particular quality of stillness that her crew had learned to recognize. The stillness that was not emptiness but fullness. The stillness of someone who had just placed something very heavy down in exactly the right place. "Den," she said. "Commander? Send the following reply." She paused, organizing the words the way she always organized things, from the center outward. "To Fleet Commander Osen, I received your message. I believe you. We will talk. There is a great deal to do, and we will need each other to do it. Take care of yourself. The galaxy cannot afford to lose the people in it who are trying to make it better. Voss." "Sent," Den said. The Endurance moved on through the dark. 9 ships now, a fleet of 530 people including the 8 they had pulled from the dying research station, and the 222 who had been with her since the beginning, and the hundreds who had woken up in cold dark places and found, instead of the death they had expected, something stranger and more difficult and more worth it. 500,000 people. Once there had been hundreds of billions. What had been taken could not be returned. The dead could not be recovered. The worlds that had been burned could not be unburned. The galaxy would carry that truth forward with it now, publicly, because the records were out there, because the voices of ordinary human people were now part of the available history that any species could access if they chose to. The mathematics teacher, the woman with her soup, the girl and her best friend. They were in the galaxy's memory now. That was not nothing. That was, in some ways, everything. You could silence a people while they lived, but you could not silence them once the record of their existence had been distributed beyond the reach of any single power. Mara Voss stood at the observation window one more time, on a quiet ship night while most of the crew slept, and she looked at the stars. She was 40 years old. She looked older than that. She would probably never stop looking older than that. She did not mind. She thought about all the things that were still undone. The Halvan Challenge, the Keth-Vorath War and its aftermath, the long, difficult work of building something real out of what they had, the archive, which Lena was leading with a passion that made Mara proud, in a way she could not have described adequately, the fleet, which needed to be maintained and trained and kept ready, the diplomacy, which was going to require patience she would have to find new reserves of. She thought about what her parents would think if they could see her, the people in the photograph, smiling on the beach. She thought they would recognize her. They might not immediately understand what she had become, but they would recognize it, the thing in her that had always been there, that had driven every choice she had made, since she was old enough to make choices. The part that did not accept things as finished when they were not finished. The part that looked at impossible situations and found, not an easy way through, but a way through. She was her parents' daughter. She was her people's commander. She was the surviving soul of a civilization that had been told it was over, and had decided, quietly, patiently, with grief and determination in equal measure, that it was not. The galaxy had declared humanity extinct. The announcement had been calm and official and certain, and it had been wrong. And now the galaxy knew it was wrong, and now the galaxy had to decide what to do with that knowledge. That decision, what civilizations do when they are confronted with a truth they cannot unlearn, was where real change happened. Not in battles, though battles had their place. Not in grand gestures, though the broadcast had been necessary. In the slow, patient, deeply difficult work of making a galaxy understand something it had preferred not to understand, and holding it responsible for that understanding. It would take years. It might take generations. The people who were 500 on 9 ships today might not live to see the end of it. The children who would be born to these people, and there would be children, Mara intended to make sure of that. The archive was not just about history but about future. Those children might be the ones who finally saw a reckoning that felt complete. She did not know. She could not know. The future was not something you could see. Only something you could work toward with the best tools you had, and the clearest intentions you could maintain, and the honesty to admit when you were wrong. But she knew this. The Endurance was alive. The fleet was alive. The people were alive. The records existed. The voices of 500,000 ordinary people were now distributed through the galaxy's communications networks, impossible to fully retrieve or silence. A Sural commander who had voted against the genocide had spoken publicly, and offered to keep speaking. The Halvan were challenging the legal framework of the whole terrible thing. The Keth and the Vorath were busy destroying each other, which was not justice, but was at least a kind of consequence, and it created space for other things to happen. Things were moving, not fast, not without cost, not without pain, but moving. And Mara Voss, the commander of the last human warship, stood at the observation window of the ship that had become everything, and looked at the stars that had watched humanity for 10,000 years, and would watch what came next for 10,000 more, and she held the future in her mind, the way she had learned to hold it, carefully, firmly, with complete intention to keep it intact, until she reached the place where she could put it down and let it become real. The galaxy had declared humanity extinct. It was wrong, and the correction of that wrongness, the long, patient, real, difficult, necessary correction of it, was just beginning. She turned away from the window. The ship hummed around her, full of sleeping people. She went to her quarters and sat at her desk and opened the worn notebook and wrote, because she had always found that writing helped her think, and there was still a great deal of thinking to be done. She wrote until the ship's morning cycle began, and the lights came up, and the sounds of people waking and moving and beginning another day filled the corridors of the Endurance, which was still alive, which would remain alive, which would not go quiet, which would not go dark, which would carry its people, and their grief, and their purpose, and their memory, through the cold between the stars, until the work was done. Until the reckoning was real. Until the galaxy understood what it had chosen to do, and chose differently. Until humanity, which had never been finished, and had never agreed to be finished, had made that truth visible to every corner of the dark. She kept writing. Outside, the stars waited. They had time. So did she.